So welcome everybody to the Sustainability Speaker Series. We're really excited here to have Mr. Alvaro Sanchez, who's the Director of Environmental Equity at the Greenlining Institute. And I've been following the Greenlining Institute's work for a little while, and I've been really impressed because they both are trying to kind of untangle the systemic racism in the U.S. system, but also, really pay a lot of attention to providing kind of an affirmative vision for what kind of a just environmental equity, just climate policy would look like. And so I really like those kind of both sides of the coin, which seem like we need both, right? To dismantle, forms of oppression and yet also put forth this affirmative vision. So I've been really impressed with their work. And Mr. Sanchez, thanks so much for joining us today. And we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to present. And when I started this, everyone, coming at you live from Pico Rivera here in Southern California. And yeah, I look forward to being able to share a little bit about our work with you and the conversation that we're going to have as we go through this. So the Greenlining Institute, we're a 26-year-old organization that's been working to bring economic opportunities to low-income communities of color through research, through policy, through advocacy, and leadership development. We envision a nation where communities of color and race, we envision a nation where communities of color thrive and race is never a barrier to economic opportunity. And really, for the time that we have together, I have two main objectives. Number one is to set a foundation about why we focus so much on racial equity in our climate work. And then second, to begin to provide some ideas about how we go about addressing those structural things that we need to address in our policymaking in order to achieve not only a cleaner and healthier planet, but also a more just and equitable one. So those are really the goals that I have for my conversation with you today. So today, we're going to be talking very explicitly about race. And if I do this right, it will make some of us feel a little bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. Because being uncomfortable is a necessary part of the process in our collective work towards racial justice and sustainability. Now, many of us were taught, growing up, that it isn't polite actually to talk about race. But working on equity and doing it right means that we can't ignore this country's racist legacy, and it means that we must recognize the present day struggles that our Black and Brown communities face because of it. So today, I'm going to talk very explicitly about racial equity. But before we get going and sharing with you some information about racial equity, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what that means. And this is actually really critical to our work because everybody seems to be tossing the word equity around these days. And very seldom do we all use the same definition for what that is. And it's really important that we establish a shared definition of racial equity because your ecosystem might be working on racial equity that's different from other folks. And it's very important for us to be explicit about it. For Greenlining, racial equity means transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach full potential. This is what it means to us. This is what guides all of the work that we do on racial equity. In your ecosystem, it might mean something different, and that's not bad. It's just important that you know what that means for your organization and who you're working with. So now that we have that as a foundation, in order to tell you why race matters in policy and why we must lead with racial equity, I'm going to tell you three stories. First, I'm going to tell you the story of the past and recount the history of race in America and how it relates to our built environment and our economy. Then, I'll tell you the story of today and how the past manifests in pain and injustice for people of color and how we're beginning to tackle that. And finally, I'll tell you the story of tomorrow and how we can work together to create a society that is just, healthy, and a society where all people can thrive. So we're going to start with the story of the past. So imagine that you're in the middle of the 1930s and it's the Great Depression. Many families at this time are struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. In response, the federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help bolster families' wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. Many historians credit this policy with helping families rebuild their lives during this crisis. But there's also a shameful side of the story, and one that is not very often talked about. It is one that is rooted in racism and that our government and the real estate industry are directly responsible for. To figure out how to distribute mortgages, governments work with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on their credit risk. San Jose, as you see in this map, was one of those communities. They created a grading system based on several factors, like quality housing. But the primary indicator of risk was race. The neighborhoods that were graded based on color codes, as you see here. Green, meaning best, blue, meaning still desirable, yellow, meaning definitely declining, and red, meaning hazardous. Areas that were redlined were seen as credit risk because of the presence of people of color. This is where the term redlining comes from. And between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of loans, with more than 98% of those going to white families. This lack of investments in community of color has led to extreme wealth inequality that we see today along racial lines. So another example that I can share with you about the past is from an audit that was performed by surveyors of Oakland in 1937. And as you can see here, it includes offensive language, and it explicitly names, quote, the infiltration of Negroes and Orientals as the detrimental influence on this community and the reason for its redlining. Now, to further illustrate how wrong this policy was, the Federal Housing Administration had a manual which said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. Now, for good measure, the manual also recommending using highways as a good measure to separate Black neighborhoods from white ones. So for all intents and purposes, this was a system of segregation. And redlining was instituted all over the country. And as we know today, homeownership is the primary way that families build intergenerational wealth. And people of color were effectively locked out of that opportunity. Now, I want to be clear, redlining still exists today. It's just done in more subtle ways. Today, Black home buyers are still twice as likely to be declined for a home loan than white home buyers are. And redlining didn't just impact home ownership. Redlining, combined with zoning, disenfranchisement, and disinvestment, concentrated polluting industries and highways in these neighborhoods. And while redlining was technically outlawed decades ago, this lack of investment still has lingering impacts today. And so another story of the past is the story of highways and the systematic redesign of our cities for the automobile. Highways were constructed often directly through communities of color. This destroyed local neighborhood economies and locked air pollution and detrimental health impacts for decades to come. These highways enabled white flight from cities to the suburbs, which were often designed as white-only neighborhoods. And as a result, this trend shifted investment in commercial development and corporate headquarters and other businesses from cities and into wealthier and wider suburbs. Now, this neglect and disinvestment of inner cities across the United States only further disenfranchised communities of color, turning the urban core into places that were undesirable and making it more difficult for people to create an economic system that worked for them there. So ever since the founding of this country under genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, to the immigration camps of today, race has always determined winners and losers in America. The private sector and public sector work hand in hand to build these structures of inequality. And this, over time, has accumulated and compounded impacts in these communities. The impacts is that many generations of individuals and institutions have been conditioned to fear Black and brown folks, to see us as subhuman, to see us as inferior and not worthy of their time or investment. And the result is that these attitudes and policies work together to prop up segregation, racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy. Now let's remember that this history was not created by just a few bad actors. These were all deliberate public policy decisions that were carried out by the federal, state, and local government. Government created these injustices, and so government must also play an important role in solving it. So the story of the past is hard, and it hits pretty heavy. But I'm showing you all these photos and this information because we always have to keep this legacy in mind. Because while I wish that I could say that racial injustice is a thing of the past, it isn't. And our country has never really fully confronted this legacy of racial injustice in a meaningful way. And I think we have to, if we're going to create the type of environment that we want to live in moving forward. So now that we talked about the story of the past, I want to talk about the story of today. COVID-19 is pulling the curtains on America's deep-rooted inequities. People of color are the most impacted. While Latinx communities are seeing the highest number of COVID cases, African-American communities make up the highest number of mortality. The economic impacts associated with COVID-19 are similarly impacting Black and Brown communities most severely. And when I saw the map of COVID cases in Oakland, I could not help but notice the striking similarities with two other maps. What you see here is the map of Cal and Virus screen in the middle, which is what California uses to determine communities that are burdened by poverty and pollution. The brighter the red, the worse the condition. And you see the 1937 map of redlining in Oakland. And again, you see basically the same communities that were redlined are the same communities that today are suffering the worst impact of COVID-19. Policies like redlining, this did not just limit access to economic opportunity. The combination of being locked out of home ownership, plus disenfranchisement, plus lack of representation and systematic oppression, resulted in communities that could not control what was happening to them. Race is the biggest predictor of someone that lives near a polluting facility in California and across the country. If you're a poor person of color, you're almost guaranteed to live near facilities that have been proven to be detrimental to human life. Environmental racism is nothing new. It is built on a foundation of policy decisions designed with race as a principal factor, implemented by government, reinforced and ratified by law enforcement and the courts, and exploited by private companies to reap economic benefits at the expense of vulnerable communities. All of this translates to a loss of life, literally. People of color all over the country have life expectancies far below that of white communities due to where they live. And these conditions have perpetuated a massive wealth gap that persists today. For every dollar of wealth a white family has, the median Black family has 8 cents, and that's not accident. It's a result of deliberate policy choices. And this wealth inequality is one that continues to persist, and one that we've had for a very long time. When I looked at this graph, I was just struck. I could not actually believe the numbers. And it's because it's measuring wealth. And as I mentioned before, communities of color in the US have been locked out of multi-generation wealth building, mostly through home ownership. So these numbers become more real. If you haven't been able to build multi-generational wealth, you don't pass that wealth on to future generations. So it's no surprise that wealth for Black folks and Latino folks has not increased in the same way that white folks have been able to build wealth. And another stat that's been striking for me to hear is that if we were to address wealth inequality in the United States, we would generate almost as much in GDP as the country of India. So it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, because it would improve our economic performance to such a high degree that we would almost be matching what India produces on a yearly basis. So it's no surprise also that COVID cases are disproportionately concentrated in Latinx and Black communities. In this graph, you see Latinx and Black communities contain a higher percentage of cases compared to their share of the population in Alameda County. Notice that white people in Alameda County account for more than 40% of the population and make up only 15% of COVID cases, whereas Latinx people account for 25% of COVID cases, but make up less than 25% of Alameda County's population. So as we recover from these crises, we must do so with equity at their core. Equity is not good, equality, sorry, is not good enough because the most impacted have been most impacted for a very long time and require additional resources to catch up. They are further behind, not because they didn't work hard enough. They are further behind because of genocide, slavery, imperialism, and white supremacy. Equity is not a special interest, it's a common one. And if we care deeply about people, planet, and prosperity, we have to embrace equity. So what does this all mean for climate policy? In this slide, I wanted to share with you some of the most important approaches that California is implementing to address our climate impact. California, as many of you know, is one of the leaders worldwide when it comes to tackling climate change. We have strategies for everything, from our cars, to our food, to our buildings, to our appliances, to our land use. We're really trying to tackle this problem at an economy-wide scale, and that's fantastic. One of the things that we're trying to work on is to limit pollution by implementing something called cap and trade. Some of you may have heard about this. Cap and trade is a system that puts a price on the additional pollution that industry is producing and generates resources that are invested in communities to mitigate pollution. And over time, the cap continues to decrease, making it more expensive to pollute and encouraging industries to transition to renewable energy sources in order for them to save cost of that pollution that they're producing. Theoretically, it sounds like a great model. In implementation, there's a lot of work that we need to do on it because there's been some unintended consequences in terms of continuing to promote pollution, again, in disadvantaged communities, which is where these facilities often live. So we're going to put that aside for a second. And I just want to share that we need to work to solidify our cap and trade system and address those injustices and inequities. But for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to use the cap and trade system because it's been one of the things that we've been working on at Greenlining to try to introduce equity in how this is being implemented. So the cap and trade system, ever since its implementation, has generated over $12 billion for the state of California to invest in a variety of programs that reduce pollution, and many of the ones that you see here listed on this slide. Anything from high-speed rail to affordable housing to urban greening, urban forestry, a big menu of programs are being invested in with the funds from this cap and trade system. What we did at Greenlining is we worked on passing two pieces of policy, SB 535 and AB 1550, that directs California to invest a minimum of 35% of the revenue collected by cap and trade into disadvantaged communities. So here I have the map of Oakland again. And all of the colored in areas are the jurisdictions that are eligible to receive that minimum percentage of investment. And if I was to bring this map back with the COVID map and the calendar screen map, the redlining map, it's very much those same communities that we're now proactively saying we need to make investments in. And this is turning into real, tangible benefits. Over $3 billion in implemented funds have now been invested in SB 535 and AB 1550 communities. Combined, they're called priority communities. And over $971 million over the last 3 years have been invested in programs that Greenlining believes carry with them really strong equity components. And it doesn't stop there. The work of SB 535 and AB 1550 has actually now been implemented at the California Public Utilities Commission, at the Energy Commission, and through some bond measures. And one of the examples that I have here is that it's influenced over $530 million that are being invested in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles from our investor-owned utilities, with the commitment going to those same communities that I showed in the map previously. And these are turning into real life things that communities are benefiting from. It's being, the investment numbers you see on this slide are translating into affordable housing opportunities in Berkeley, urban forestry programs in Los Angeles, EV car share programs in Los Angeles, and bus rapid transit in San Diego, and many, many other programs across the state. And moving forward, we're going to continue with this approach and emphasizing that we need to make proactive investments in communities that have been most impacted and harmed, such as what we were trying to do with AB 3256, which was going to be a $10 billion revenue source for climate adaptation and resilience that unfortunately did not make the cut this last legislative session, but we will be sure to bring this back up when the legislative session begins, because we need to generate resources to make investments in climate adaptation and resilience. So with that, I want to go into the story of tomorrow, in the last part of our series. We at Greenlining believe that we need to transition away from a red-line economy and into a green-line economy. A red-line economy is one that's built with power, racism, and profit at its core, and that uses methods of hyper-productivity, individualism, segregation, and extraction in order to deliver outcomes that are white supremacy, income inequality, climate change, concentration of power. I mean, that's what we have today. And we're making the argument that we need to transition towards a green line economy, one that makes equity real, that equitably distributes power, that concentrates communities of color, and that at its core is community-centered, but it's non-exploitative, it's inclusive, it's democratic, it's cooperative, it's regenerative. All things I think that everybody wants to see in the world. Where the outcomes of this economy are one that promote racial justice, shared prosperity, and resilient ecosystems. So I'm sure you'll ask, well, how do we get there? This is probably not going to get us all the way there, but it's a start. And what we're calling these are the rules of the game. And really, we need to be thinking at that level. We need to change the rules of the game, because we won't get to that future that we all want to see if we don't actually proactively address the root causes of what's making the conditions that we have today. So this first set of standards that we've developed are intended to be attached to the kinds of work that we need to do to address this systematic issue. So moving forward, what we want to promote is that when we are thinking about strategies, investment, policies, et cetera, that we need to have rules that emphasize anti-racist solutions, that we prioritize multi-sectoral approaches, because communities are not just facing one impact or one deficiency, they're experiencing multiple ones, that we need to develop intentional benefits, no more trickle-down benefits to people, that we need to build community capacity, because communities need to have the tools at their disposal to be able to determine their own future and how they want to get there, that we need to be community-driven at every stage, that we need to establish paths towards wealth building. And as you see in the diagram here, we imagine these investment standards or rules to be at the level of policy and regulation. We're literally making up the rules. And that the more that our policy and regulation adopts these kinds of standards, the more we'll get to that green line economy framework, where the system is actually now adopting these kinds of approaches. But the work needs to be even more specific. And that's where I want to introduce the Making Equity Real framework. One of the things that we've noticed is that these days, again, equity is a word that everybody seems to be very easily, it's rolling off everyone's tongue. And that's fine. It's actually better in that way. But as anything, a commitment without a plan of action is just a promise. And a promise could be very easily broken. And we want to prevent against that. So what we're saying now is, when we make commitments about equity, we need to make sure that we're explicit about what that commitment is going to turn into as it relates to process, implementation, and analysis. So if your goal is to deliver equity, what do you have to do to change your process? Who has to be at the decision-making table? Are you supposed to compensate people for their time? That should lead towards implementation approaches that are advancing the goals that you have about equity. And then we need to measure for that. So we've developed a series of resources, and you can find those on our website, about making equity real in grant programs, making equity real in climate adaptation and resilience, making equity real in transportation, and our most recent one, making equity real in research. Because as more research institutions are asking us to contribute an equity component to their research, we've come to learn that in research, we need to make equity real too. So we developed a pretty comprehensive approach about what researchers should be thinking about if they want to introduce equity, either as how they do their work or the output of their work. So it feels fairly straightforward and simple to require folks to think about these 4 steps in developing policies, programs, funding sources. But you would be surprised how often we learn that this is not being thought about at all. People don't think about who isn't at the decision-making table and should they be. People are not thinking about, does our implementation actually lead to equity outcomes, or is it actually reinforcing and extending the life of approaches that are against our equity commitments? And maybe you won't be surprised about this, but nobody measures anything. So when it comes to equity, people are not really measuring whether or not they're meeting their goals. So these are the kinds of questions that we're asking these days, and wanting to work with people on answering these questions, because it's really a collective effort. Equity is not something that should just be given to someone to figure out. It's our collective work for us to do together. Nobody has the keys to equity. Equity is something that has to be tackled at the system level, and it has to be tackled with everybody involved. And equity also is not something that is just the add-on or the afterthought or the one thing that you have on the side that you really kind of, in your values you want to do, but you're not devoting the time to actually figure out how to do it well. Equity has to be really immersed in the overall approach. And we hope that this framework is one of the ones that helps answer, or at least begin the conversation about how we go about doing that work. So just to conclude, at the moment that we're in, we need to obviously recover from COVID, recover from climate change, recover from the state of our democracy. But in doing so, we have to reimagine what the new world is going to look like. Because if you say that we're just going to recover to pre-COVID conditions, that's not good enough. We need to have something better. And as we reimagine, we need to transform. We need to transform a future that's not rooted in white supremacy and extraction and in genocide, but one that is rooted in our collective well-being, in ecosystems working with each other, and us as humans in this planet being able to contribute to each other's well-being, as opposed to competing for the crumbs that we're left with behind. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I really thank you for giving me the time.
Hey, thank you so much. That was great. And I like the story framework, the past, present, future. It's a nice encapsulation of your work. So I think we'll open it up now. Rachel, do you want to do it like the way we've been doing it in the Tuesday series, or just let's open it up generally?
Yeah, it's first up is Elizabeth. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Elizabeth, and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for coming and taking time to speak with us. Wonderful presentation on difficult issues that hopefully we're tackling a little bit better every day. I have a question about the Making Equity Real framework. I don't know if it's easy to put that slide back up just to remind me a little bit, but the question about the framework is basically just how you see, or if you have seen any change, let's say in this year, in terms of all of these steps. I mean, I feel like I move around a little bit at the nexus of like philanthropy and policy and environmental, I'm in the environmental policy program. And, it seems like the talk has become magnified about certain aspects in certain places. And so I'm just wondering what your perspective is on how things maybe are shifting and whether that gives you optimism or feels like more of the same, kind of maybe greenwashing, whitewashing, some kind of washing. That's what I'm curious about.
Yes, we don't want equity washing either. It's a good question, and I think what I'm seeing right now is a window of opportunity opening. So many people were not having this discussion at the beginning of this year. But given everything that we've gone through this year, people are having it now in philanthropy, in government, in the private sector, and academia. Some of those have become very difficult conversations because I think it's really required some folks to hold the mirror up to themselves and to say, how am I contributing to this issue? I don't know if y'all seen, but there's been some big name environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club, who have been very outspoken about its racist beginnings. And I think that that's actually really important, just to acknowledge that even if it's an environmental organization that today is doing work to improve our planet, that doesn't mean that they didn't have a past that they need to acknowledge and work on. So what I'm seeing today around this framework is that, in fact, yes, a lot of people are using the framework to make decisions about their work. We've been using this framework with the California Air Resources Board, with the Strategic Growth Council, and with the California Public Utilities Commission around structuring certain programs that they've been able to develop. Some of these include the Transformative Climate Communities, which is a catalytic investment program that makes investments in disadvantaged communities for a variety of different sustainability measures that are determined by the people that live in those communities. And there's been 7 implementation awards, anywhere between $25 million and $70 million that have been distributed across the state. There's another program called the Sustainable Transportation Equity Program, operated out of the Strategic Growth Council, that uses this framework to be able to develop some of these components around equity, about how we're going to achieve equity through those goals. And we're actually doing a lot with philanthropy these days around what does it mean to do this kind of work and embed equity into their strategies. 2 things that I'll highlight. We're conducting a research project around exploring zero emission zones. This would be literal zones in neighborhoods where our jurisdiction would require the vehicles that operate within the zone to be zero emission, mostly for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Think about delivery trucks. And if you can operate that kind of vehicle, perhaps assessing a fee for vehicles that need to continue to operate in those communities, but instead have to pay a fee for continuing to pollute that place. So that's something that we're working on with philanthropy to try to figure out what are the equity considerations that need to be attached to that kind of policymaking, and something that we're pretty excited about.
Thank you. And if I can ask a follow-on question, I don't know if there are more people queued up, but it's related, but a slightly different topic. The law that was just passed, I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago now, to establish the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great start. It's something to take a look at. I mean, you want to talk about equity. Reparations is something that has to be on the table. It's very clear that we built the wealth of this country on the backs of slaves, people who were never compensated for the work that they did. And I think it is time for us to be thinking about how do we undo that justice? I mean, we've done other injustices. Why don't we address that one? So I think it's something to consider. Something else that we're proposing is that at the state level, again, all of this work this is really hard work, I would say. This equity work is really hard work because it's basically about everything, but it's also a specific niche of the work that we all need to do. And I think what we are proposing these days is that California needs a statewide office of racial equity. This has to be part of our state infrastructure, so that conversations such as a reparations task force, or I don't know if y'all saw, but a public letter was released last week, I'm sorry, from Black staff at the California Air Resources Board, sharing their experience in an environment that they felt was not welcoming and limiting their opportunities. When those types of things come up, we need to have a structural response to it, not just the kind of response that happened, which was just a limited response to the issue. So I think in order for us to make progress in a systematic way, we need a systematic approach. And I think I appreciate the task force that has been established. And I think we need to do more of that work. So this upcoming year, we will be introducing legislation to establish a statewide office of racial equity. And in fact, actually, the state of Washington already approved the statewide office of racial equity. So California wouldn't even be the first one in the country to establish something like that. It would be following Washington State's lead.
Thank you.
Great. No, that was actually related to my question here. I've been working a lot on climate policy around kind of coastal areas and ocean and coastal resources. And, if Biden wins next week, there's a lot of money that's probably going to pour into economic development, both for kind of the recession, but also climate focus. We see this synergy of kind of climate investment that will be good for the pandemic response as well as for the future. And so we've been thinking a lot of what's the equity component to that? How should we think about these trillions of dollars that are going to be coming up in the federal government? Some of it for workforce development, some of it for infrastructure development. Could you give us some thinking of, if we really want to build equity into that investment, what are the key specifics we should be really aiming for?
Yeah, great question. That's why we developed these investment standards, because we were starting to notice that, one, California has, like I mentioned, generate a ton of resources to make investments in disadvantaged communities. And we've actually worked on the implementation on many of those resources. And what we've learned is essentially that the things that are getting in the way of that kind of economic investment are these things. They're not, they continue to be trickle down. They continue to, large scale investments, stimulus investments, continue to have a preference for shovel ready projects. They continue to be incredibly siloed when they shouldn't really be siloed. And I would say stop short of thinking about how do we build wealth associated with this investment. It's almost like an infusion of resources, and then it just like the spigot just turns off, and then there's nothing more following. And then the last thing that I'll say is that as it relates to community engagement, not even equity, just engaging the community that these investments are going to be in, they leave a lot to be desired. Most of the time, it's just an information. People are given information about maybe what's happening, but people are not being asked to be collaborators or meaningful participants in the approach, et cetera. So we developed this guidebook. It's called the Greenlining Economy Guidebook, where these standards come from. And we have a lot more details in that guidebook about what does this mean? What do these words on the slide mean? But I think that these are the kinds of rules that we would want to attach to a federal stimulus package. These are the kinds of rules and approaches that we would want to attach to California-based, investment conversations, many of which are already happening. And from our experience, people actually kind of know what to do with these rules. I'm like, okay, we get it. We can actually figure these out. So they're not like, nothing too complicated, but it's just often not included in the conversation. And then the last thing I'll say is that for those kinds of investments, we have to actually question whether or not the rules attached to some of those investments need to be changed altogether. I'll give you an example that I had no clue about government funding before starting this work. I didn't understand that government funding basically all the time works on a reimbursement basis, right? You have to have the money up front, spend it, and then you get reimbursed by government. Well, what if you don't have money to start with? Like, what if your city actually literally has no money to begin the project? Well, that means that structurally you're barred from participating in any of the stimulus money because you won't be able to gain access to the reimbursements, right? You just don't have the money to get going. So this is something called like advanced payment. I had no clue that this even existed. But one of the things that we're pushing for now is to allow government funding for these kinds of investments to be eligible for communities to receive 25 to 50% of the funds upfront for them to be able to actually get the work going. because that was just barring so many places and so many organizations from being able to pursue this because they just were, they didn't have money to get going. And I think even some policymakers don't know that that actually is a rule. So policymakers need to be better acquainted with, okay, so once we approve a 3 trillion or whatever number it is Biden climate plan, like functionally, how is it going to work? I think people need to ask that question more, because there's a lot in the implementation of that stimulus money that reinforces some of the inequities that we see now. Sorry, that was a kind of a long-winded answer, but yeah, it's a really good one, and hopefully that gave you some indications.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. I might follow up with you for some of those materials you were talking about. So thank you so much.
All right, Dean Fernando de Palis, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Alvaro. I'm Fernando de Palis. I'm also a professor here at the Institute, both in the environmental policy and the development policy programs, and also happen to be the dean of the graduate school of policy and management. And I realized that we both have a Southern California urban planning education. I just have it on the other side of town. You imagine where it's all cool.
Go Bruins.
Yeah, well, it happens. We can go all to the same school, right? But first, thank you so much for being with us today, and also thank you for the extraordinary work that you guys are doing. It is just absolutely phenomenal. Probably less than Jason, I've known your work for a little, for a couple of years, only out of the almost 30 years of the organization, and it's just remarkable. And also how much what you have presented today coincides with many of the philosophical principles of both the Institute, our graduate programs, and what we teach in our classes. So you're among peers here, at least philosophically speaking. I apologize because I have to step out to take a call, and I don't know if this was mentioned, but I'm curious to know a little more. What are your partners? What other organizations on the non-governmental organization and non-profit side are collaborating with you? Because I imagine that some of these things are immense amount of work, and it have to be done in many fronts at once. So if you have a minute or two on who are your main partners. Other than that, thank you so much, Alvaro. We'll see you around some other time.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing all of that. And it was a hard choice. I chose USC, but I was so close to going to UCLA because, yeah, that was closer to my heart. But, USC had a bigger scholarship, so I went to USC. In terms of partnership, yeah, all of this work all of it is done in partnership. And I often talk to my team about the need to cultivate the ecosystem that's going to make change happen. And that ecosystem involves folks in the nonprofit sector, of course, folks in philanthropy, folks in government, and even the private sector. In terms of our our nonprofit partners, we primarily partner with environmental justice and equity organizations, to name a few: Asian Pacific Environmental Network, SCOPE down here in LA, Environmental Health Coalition down in San Diego, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability in the Central Valley. And then they also work with a lot of more mainstream environmental organizations. The big names: Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC, NextGen, and then some of the smaller ones like California Relief. It's a small shop. It's all about forestry, but they've been actually an incredible partner, and we've worked really, really, really closely with them. And then when it comes to government, we roll up our sleeves and get to work with government because it's going to be them. They're the ones who are going to have to set the rules. And we need to actually have them be core partners in this work. So we work really closely with the Strategic Growth Council, with the California Air Resources Board, with the Energy Commission, with the California Public Utilities Commission. And it's anywhere from just, participating in their processes all the way to literally sitting down and writing guidelines with them. And not as comments, but what comes before the comments. We help draft the first draft of those, guidelines. And I think it's because of this equity piece. Again, they are hired as experts in their field, and equity is not something that they were hired to be experts about. So they kind of need that help. And we could really easily say like, well, it's your job, figure it out. But we don't take that approach. I think the approach that we take is like, well, we need to help because otherwise we're going to leave this to someone else who maybe doesn't know it either. And whatever we end up getting is something going to be suboptimal to what we want. So partnerships, it's the name of the game, and we definitely, do all of this work in close collaboration with our partners.
Thank you. Well, now you can add another name to that list of partners. So just let us know what we can help with, and we'll go for it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. I apologize again, but I have to step out and go, guess what, to another Zoom meeting. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that too. This is a community that, we're very much, we can rally behind a cause, and if you need people to show up or to, to join meetings or to write letters, please let us know and we'll spread the word here at the Middlebury Institute. Okay, and next up is Kimberly. Kimberly, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, I had a brief question, and I think you've kind of touched on it, kind of on like the lack of equal representation in those offices making all of the decisions to be, strive to be more equitable in communities. But have you seen kind of like a push to have more equal representation in those rooms, or do you think there should be like maybe like a program implemented to help, like bridge that gap? Or I don't know, what have you seen with like a change within like representation in those rooms?
Yeah, I would say that there's a strong desire for decision-making bodies to be more representative. We're not there yet. We're not even close. And I think that this is something that we need to continue to work on. And what I'll mention here is two important things. Number one is, yes, we need more representation. We need, government bodies. Greenlining has worked a lot on diversity of corporate boards, diversity of philanthropic boards. Just our decision-making bodies need to reflect the communities that they are making decisions about, and that's not happening. There's a slide that for time considerations I took out, but maybe I should have left it in, that describes that metropolitan planning organizations across the United States are predominantly white and male, despite the fact that they govern over a population that's much more diverse than that. I think, so that's something that we need to work on. Greenlining has a leadership academy where we actually recruit people of color to gain access into this field. And one of the things that we notice is that my team is able to bring on one fellow a year for to be embedded with our policy team, and we probably get about 150 applications. It's the one spot, like the one person who can gain access into this fellowship opportunity, and many of the ones who come through it, like they are very successful at what they do afterwards, but there's just not enough opportunities like the one that we offer to help people gain access into this ecosystem. The other thing that I'll mention is that we can't equate diversity with better decisions. One of the things that we've learned is that even when you have diverse representative bodies, you still need to do the work of equity, because that alone doesn't equate having better equity standards and rules and things that you work on. So diversity by itself doesn't quite do the job. It needs to be accompanied by some of the work that I talked about today. And I think that that's one of the things that I often hear and say, well, we have more people of color in the board. Why are they not doing equity work? And again, it's a skill. Like, I want to emphasize that this is a discipline. It's not just what makes you feel right. It's like there's a methodology to all this equity work. And I feel like it's often just like, well, let's just do the right thing. Well, that's different. Like, this is like policy development. This is like research. There's a rigor to this. And I think that often somehow gets missed because people just equate it to like, let's just do the right thing.
Awesome, thank you.
That's great. And I don't have any other questions lined up at the moment.
Okay. Any last minute questions here from Mr. Sanchez? All right, well, we're a few minutes shy 1:30, but I think that's a good time to wrap it up. Thank you so much again. I really impressed with the work, and I'm glad I finally got to see a formal presentation from somebody at the top line of the org. And I definitely want to reach out to you. Is it okay if other students reach out to you if they have questions about your work and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My email address is on our website. It's alvaros@greenlining.org. Please do feel free to reach out. I often repeat this in opportunities I get like this. I didn't take advantage of reaching out to folks that I met through my undergrad experience. This might be different, but yeah. The network that you established through this experience actually is really helpful moving forward, and now I understand it a lot better. So definitely, reach out. Happy to connect with folks. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but my team manages 4 streams of work. We work a lot on climate investments. Today, you heard a lot about that work, but we also work significantly on mobility equity, and that's a whole kind of different set of considerations that we take there. We work on climate adaptation and resilience. And then the last part of our work is working towards establishing a green line economy. So that's more kind of, on the theoretical longer game strategy. So if we were to chat, happy to connect. And thank you again for inviting me.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, have a great weekend. And thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening. Take care.